description if you are interested in attending that. So, all right, let's go back to James chapter 1 as we are still looking at responding to trials. I guess I should say profiting from our trials would be a better way to put that. Profiting from our trials. And man, there has been some good information in these 4 verses so far. Maybe, I told you when I started this, it was sort of unexpected and I wasn't sure where we were going to go with it. I think I probably will finish verse 4 today. That'll probably about tie up the main thing that was kind of, I guess, on my heart that I wanted to say. And then we may do a quick look next week at the rest of the entire chapter, because I mentioned that this whole chapter 1 is actually about trials. It may not seem like it when you read it. It seems disconnected, but it isn't. It's absolutely connected. So I think next week we might get the rest of the chapter all at one time just to show you how it connects. And then there's one other thought back in verse 2 that I want to touch on for sure one week, and then we might be done with these. So we'll see. All right, James chapter 1, all about our trials. If you've heard me say that if you're a Christian, 3 things are true about you all the time. You either are in a trial, you've just come out of a trial, or you're about to go into a trial. And that is because God has a plan for you that is bigger than the plan you have for yourself. And that is to make you like Christ. And the way He accomplishes that, in part, are through trials. James starts off, he jumps in. He introduces himself in verse 1, and then he jumps in verse 2. If you think about what you're reading here with this just almost unthinkable statement right off the bat in his letter, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. What in the world is James thinking? Does he honestly expect us to consider the trials in our lives as a source of joy? And remember, I've said before that trials to one person are not necessarily the same to another person. That, right? These things can differ greatly from person to person in regard to what a trial is. That's a thought I want to come back to, not today, but before we're done in James here. What is a trial anyway, right? But does he honestly expect us to consider trials, especially some of them can be very grievous, as a source of joy in our life? Well, he absolutely expects us to consider them that way. And one other thing you've heard me say through this study is, when you think about how we can respond to trials, the trials don't get to determine how we respond to them. Even we don't get to determine how we respond to them. Our Father gets to determine, as in all things, how we handle some certain things. And He's told us here to respond to trials, or at least to consider them a source of great joy. Now, how are we going to do that? How are you going to take a terrible set of circumstances or a terrible situation that comes your way and all of a sudden consider that to be a source of joy in your life? James tells us how in the first 4 verses. He says, first of all, in order for a trial to be a source of joy, you have to only consider it from the perspective of the truth. From the perspective of the truth. That's verse 3. Okay? And what I mean by that is this. Typically when a trial hits us, what do? We can only see the circumstances. We tend to only be caught up in what's happening to us, how bad it is, right? What the result may be. We only tend to see the trial. But if you only view your trials through the perspective of the trial, you're not considering the truth about this thing. Because the trial itself, the circumstances you're in, they aren't the truth about the situation. The truth, James says in verse 3, that knowing this, the testing of your faith produces patience. That's the truth. The trial is not irrelevant, but it's not what's most important. What's most important is how you respond. The reason that trials are sent into our life is to see how we will respond. Because the way we respond is what does all the magic, if you will, right? The way you choose to respond to the trial tells you everything you need to know about your faith. about how real it is and sort of what quality it is. You remember I spent some time in verse 3 talking about how the language there was a reference to testing metal, testing gold to see how pure it was and whether it was real and these other sorts of things, right? And so this is the first thing James wants us to know. You have to consider your trial from the perspective of the truth if you want to find joy in it. And the truth is, the trial is not what's important. What's important is how you respond. Here's the thing. He goes on to tell us in verse 3 that there's only one way to respond. And that is with endurance. 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 You remember, I hope, that I've told you as we've studied this, that when a trial comes your way, if you respond with... Now listen, I don't mean to make light of anybody's, and I'm not trying to do that. We're all going to have those moments when we kind of feel sorry for ourselves. We're going to find ourselves afraid in the midst of our trial. We're going to struggle with them. They're tough. They're trials. That's the word that he uses, right? But if you respond to your trial entirely with this sort of woe is me, and you respond to it only through fear, and maybe you get angry with God, and how could you do this to me, and those sorts of things, that's the wrong way to respond to a trial if you're a person of faith. What James says here is the only proper way to respond to our trials as a person of faith is with endurance. You double down. When a trial comes your way, if you find yourself drawing nearer to God, you find yourself loving God more, you find yourself trusting Him more, you find more holiness in your life, you find greater commitment to Christ, guess what you've done? You've responded to your trial in a godly way. You have done what God intended you to do when He sent the trial into your life. Your faith showed up. The test came and your faith showed up. And the quality of your faith showed up. And it's proven by the way you handle that trial. Now what we looked at last week was the beginning of verse 4. He says, let endurance finish its work. You've heard me say, I don't know how many times over what have I been here, 13, 14 years, right? That it is one thing to start a trial well, but it's a whole other thing to finish it well. You see, most of us honestly do pretty good when the bad news drops, right? We do. Most of us, we sort of put our face on and we say, you know what? The Lord's going to handle this, and we have trust. But it's one thing to start a trial that way. You let it continue. You let it get worse. No end in sight. And the cracks might start to show in your faith. And what James tells us in verse 4 last week, and that we just did that first part of verse 4, let patience have its perfect work, is he says, here's the thing. It's not enough to face your trial with endurance. That's the right response. But what you have to do is you have to let endurance finish the job. You have to let endurance, the way that it's sort of literally worded in the original language is let endurance finish what it started. Let endurance finish what it came to do. And that means bear with it. And the only way you can do that is if you consider the outcome. And so the question is this. How can my trials be a genuine source of joy in my life? Number one, you have to view them through the lens of truth. And number two, you have to consider the outcome of your trial. The outcome of your trial. And that's what he tells us in the second part of verse 4 today. Let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. There's the outcome. That's the goal, right? When the trial first comes your way, you first get the bad news, or you first have the terrible circumstance, or whatever it is, right? When the trial first comes your way, immediately, one of the things that you can rest back on is, whatever is happening to me right now, the goal is for me to be perfected. That's the end game with God. That's where He's headed with this thing. I told you last week, we often think of trials as like, well, you know, trials are what matures us. Trials is what changes us. It's not the trial that does that. I harped on this a lot last week. It's the way you respond that does it. And that's what James says here. The end game in verse 4 is that you will be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. That's why the trial came. Not just to make you miserable, not just to give you a hardship to have to go through on top of everything else. It didn't come to ruin your life. It didn't come to end your life. It came to make you perfect. It came to complete you. It came to finish a work that God is trying to finish in you. And it came to make sure that you don't lack anything where your faith is concerned. That's the reason it came. And if you can start to view your hardships through those two sort of perspectives, here's the truth about all of this, and here's what it's doing to me in reality, you will be able to consider the things you go through as a source of joy. So let's talk about this last little bit of verse 4 today. Endurance perfects you. Endurance perfects you. Look at what he says in the second half of verse 4. Let patience, that, you know, this English version here, it's confusing. So let me kind of paraphrase verse 4 rather than read it, okay? Let endurance finish the work so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. That's what James says. That's what he wrote. That's the meaning, right, behind the language sort of salad there. He says that if you will allow endurance to continue, don't just start well, stay with it. Every time you're tempted to give up, every time you're tempted to fear, you double down and you just refocus on truth and you refocus on God. You just keep enduring, no matter how long it takes. He says something is going to happen. When you let endurance do the work, he said you will end up perfect. He says, perfect there in the King James. That word perfect in Greek is the word teleoi, and it's very similar to what Jesus said on the cross, tetelestai. He said, it is finished. That's what that word perfect there means, sort of. It means finished, although it's slightly nuanced here the way James used it. The way I want you to read that, if you're one of those that mark in your Bible, you'll want to write this down, or maybe in your notes, right? What he says there is not perfect, mature, grown up, full grown. That's what that word means. When endurance has finished the work it set out to do, you will have grown up spiritually. That's what James says. And that's why you don't give up. That's why no matter how, whatever trial comes your way and how long it lasts and how bad it gets, you don't give up, because when it's all said and done, you're going to have grown up spiritually because of the way, not what you went through. I so want to point that out. You're going to grow up spiritually not because of what you went through, but the way you handled it, the way you responded. That's what does the work. And James says here, the work that it does is the work of perfecting you, growing you up spiritually. Now we know here when he says perfect, he's not talking about being perfect like Christ or being sinless, right? 1 John chapter 1 and verse 8, if we say we have no sin, we're deceiving ourselves, the truth is not in us. He's not talking about sinless perfection, as I've said. He's talking about growing up spiritually. That word perfect means what happens when you reach the end of a process. What happens when you reach the end of a process. When you've completed a bunch of stages that are necessary to accomplish something, and you get them all out of the way, you get whatever it was you were trying to accomplish. And this is what he means by this verse. Okay? Patience or endurance, if you continue to endure in the face of trials, when it's all said and done, you will find something unexpected has happened to you. You grew up spiritually. You grew up spiritually. One preacher, and I don't remember who it was, illustrated what James is trying to say in this way. He said, think back of an old pirate, when you've seen pirate movies, right? Some of y'all may have known pirates, personally. I don't know around here, but at least you've seen it in a movie. I didn't mean you particularly. You see them take out these. She laughed aloud, so you'll see them take out these telescopes or whatever, right? Whatever, and then start pulling them out, right? Click, 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 click. When they get all the way to the end, you know what you have? You have its full power, the full power of the device. That's a perfect illustration of what James is saying here. Okay? You stay with it long enough and you continue to endure through that thing that's happening to you. When you get to the end, you're going to have the full power of what it came to do. Mature you spiritually. This term sort of sets the goal for us. Okay? And James says what will happen if you bear with it and don't give up is you're going to find that when it's over with, you're going to have grown up spiritually. But not just grown up, look at what else he says in verse 4. You will be perfect, that is spiritually mature, and complete. He uses a different word there. What is he talking about that? He means whole. That Greek word there, holokleros, it means whole. And it had a really interesting sort of a usage in James' day. It meant, think of it in terms of maybe like a vase. Okay? In James' day, let's say you get a piece of pottery and you examine it, you would declare it holokleros, complete. And what that means is you couldn't see any external blemishes at all, nor could you see any internal blemishes at all, no little cracks, no. It was one thing. It was whole and it was strong. This term complete, James is sort of trying to set the goal of endurance for us here. What's going to happen is, if you endure through the course of that trial and you don't give up and you don't turn back, not only are you going to be spiritually mature, but here's what complete is sort of what spiritually mature means. You're going to have a life without any spiritual cracks. You're going to have a life in which every part is fully functional as a Christian. What James is saying here is basically this. If you continue to endure until endurance has done its work, it will have completely matured you. Completely matured you spiritually. And he says what that looks like in verse 4, the end of verse 4, you will be lacking nothing in your spiritual life. You'll be missing no aspect of godly character. It'll all be there and it'll be perfectly balanced. I dare say that most of us, probably on every given day, would admit there's a lot lacking in my life spiritually, right, as a Christian. And on any given day, every given day, there really is. There's a lot. I'm not there. I'm not close, right? And on some days, I find my life sort of compartmentalized spiritually, if that makes any sense, right? Some days, man, I'm liable to be really joyful, and some days, other days I'm liable to be especially loving, and then there are other days when I might be really patient, and some days when I might be really humble but not especially happy. It's like our Christian life is all fractured all the time. We can't ever seem to, kind of get it together and just become one thing. Well, James says that's what happens to you if you endure under pressure. It has a way of coalescing all of those Christian sort of virtues until you are one thing, and you're one thing all the time. And there's no cracks in your faith, and there's no cracks in the way that you live out your life. That's what the endurance will do for you as you continue to endure. That's what it means to be spiritually mature, by the way. And so from now on, as you hear preachers and teachers and read books, and you'll inevitably hear these people talk about being spiritually mature. What does that mean? To James, it means this. It means that your life, your spiritual life, has coalesced into this one sort of thing, and there are no cracks in it. What I am today is what I'll be tomorrow. I won't be more of this at certain times and less of this at other times. We read in Galatians of the fruit of the Spirit, right? Love, what are they out? Love, joy, peace, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, self-control, all these sorts of things, right? We'll come to a place by the work of endurance that those things, all of those things, that whole list is always present in us in equal measure all the time. And here's what's cool about that. That is what God is like. Right? We talk about God having sort of these aspects of His character. Well, He's righteous, and He's faithful, and He's just, and He's gracious, and He's loving, and He's wrath, right? And in God's nature, all of those things exist all the time, and they're all perfectly balanced with one another. That's what He's trying to turn us into as well. That's what He's got in mind for you. That you exhibit a Christian life that has all the parts it's supposed to have, and they're all always there. Always there. That's the goal. And that's what James says you got to keep your eye on when trials come if you want to see any joy in this thing. When you look at God sending something into your life, and we are going to do one session on what are trials, because you might, I don't know, be surprised. We typically think every bad thing happens to us is, oh Lord, right? Not necessarily. We need to know what He means by trials. But what will happen here, James says, is you keep your eye on that goal of if I will just bear up under this and stay the course and not be rattled and not put my eye on the fear and not put my eye on the circumstances, not put my eye on the outcome. When I get to the end of this thing, I'm going to be so much more like God than when I started. He's going to have grown me up spiritually. And if you will view your trial through those two things, the truth is that God is using it to teach you to endure, and that if you continue to endure, you will be made more like Him. You will be able to consider whatever you're going through a source of joy. All right, so what does all this mean? Here's what it means. Right? Here's sort of the take home. Perseverance, not trials. Trials, remember, trials aren't the thing. It's your reaction. Perseverance is indispensable in developing Christian character. It has to happen. And if perseverance develops Christ-like character, there must be something to persevere. And that something is trials. Let me sort of work backwards from that. If perseverance is what makes me like Christ, if I never have anything to persevere, what's going to happen? I'm never going to become like Christ. There's your joy in trials. That's the joy of trials. Perseverance makes me like Christ. But if nothing is ever sent for me to endure, it's not going to happen. So not only do trials become a necessary part of the Christian life, they become a source of great joy. Because here's what I know, when I'm going through them, this is all working like it's supposed to work. And the outcome is going to be what it's supposed to be. Let's look at a couple of other verses. You can keep your place there. Let's go to 1 Peter. We're just going to read, just take a right there in James, and you'll be at 1 Peter in a page or two. Read something that Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 5. One of the things, too, that I love about this, talking about this subject or teaching, is all the apostles teach on it. All the apostles teach on this subject in the Bible. And you know what's awesome? Not that you'd expect otherwise. They all say the same exact thing. All right? Look at what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 5. I need to get over there myself and stop talking. 1 Peter chapter 5, just one verse. Let's look at verse 10. He says, "May the God of all grace, who called us to His eternal glory by Jesus Christ, after you have suffered a while, do what?" What does he say? Same thing James says. Perfect you. Establish you. Strengthen you. Settle you. Doesn't that sound like maturity? That's a great definition of maturity. We think about people who are established and strong and settled. They're the same all the time. We tend to view that as the living definition of maturity. When we think about someone who's immature, they're all over the place, right? Like a kid. Their attention is always here, there, or yonder. Their focus is all. Their emotions are all over the place. Their lives are all over the place. There's chaos all the time. That's what immaturity looks like. And that's also what spiritual immaturity looks like. If your walk of faith is chaos all the time, it's up and it's down and it's here and it's there and it's yonder, and it's always changing, it's always a mess, it's because you're spiritually immature. And what Peter says here is, after you've suffered a while, that'll go. God will perfect you, and you'll find yourself established and strong and settled. That's what maturity looks like. And that's what it looks like when it's spiritual maturity too. A faith that is whole all the time. Paul says it this way. We're not, for the sake of time, we won't flip there, but here's the reference. Romans chapter 5. Paul says something very similar. We boast in suffering. We boast in suffering. Can you imagine? Knowing that our suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character. There's the same pattern James has been on past 3 or 4 weeks, right? Same thing Peter said. Suffering comes along. Endurance follows suffering if you're a child of God, and that sticking with it will produce this character in you that other people don't have. An unflappable sort of a character, an unflappable sort of a nature, a strong, established, settled spiritual life. That's what will come of it. And that's why James says, you're going to find joy in your trials. These are 2 things you can't forget. The truth about your trial is it was sent to produce endurance. And if it continues to do that, you're going to grow up spiritually. And that makes it a good thing, even if it doesn't seem like it is. Now, let me wrap this up. God's aim for each of us is the redemption of the whole person, if that makes any sense. Spiritual maturity is a Christian life that's not compartmentalized. Okay? It doesn't focus on one thing. It doesn't exhibit one thing above it. Spiritual maturity looks like God looks. Whole and complete, and all the parts working and fitting together perfectly all the time. Established and settled and strong. One of the things that's true about God, you know this, one of the things that I particularly love about Him is I always know what to expect from Him. No surprises, right? I go to God with my sin and I'm repentant and I'm sincere. What am I going to get? Forgiven. I don't need to. I'm not going to a God that is one way one day and a different way the next day, because He's grown up. And this is what He intends to produce in us too. Spiritual maturity is a spiritual life that's not compartmentalized. It's wholeness. The whole body and soul and spirit, as the Bible says, joined together and perfectly united. Spiritual maturity, it answers to God's demands for holiness and for love and all these sorts of things. Remember, I said, and I've said it every week so far, that God's design for each of us goes way beyond our own selfish desires for ourselves. And that design is what James says here. It is spiritual maturity. God wants us to be Christ-like in every part. The way we think, the way we feel, the way we speak, the way we act, the decisions we make, the relationships we engage in. He wants us to be spiritually mature in every part of what we are. And spiritual maturity is achieving that Christ-likeness in your whole life, across the board, your whole person, your whole manner of being. And what James teaches here, to just sort of sum it up, is very simple. Perseverance under trials is the only divinely appointed way you're ever going to grow up spiritually. And so if you find yourself, or you consider yourself, and you look at your own walk of faith, and you're thinking, I've got to have more stability here, right? My life, my Christian life can't be up and down all the time and scattered. And stability is maturity. Then what's going to happen is you're going to have to change the way you respond to the things God sees. Because that's the only way that maturity comes. Here's why. This is, I promise, will be the last thing to say about this. This is something you could just teach and teach. Here's why. Because trials, one of the things they do is they expose deficiencies in our lives, right? And what happens after that is we need to let grace supply what's lacking. That's why it works the way it works. So if you want to grow up spiritually, and I hope that you all do, it's only going to come one way. As you respond to the difficulties God seems to make it happen. So measure very carefully from now on in your lives how you respond to the difficulties God sends. Because if you respond wrong, not only did you not help yourself in that you're not going to grow spiritually, but another one's going to have to come to accomplish the same result. Right? And so it's all about how we respond to trials. Lord's will, next week, we're going to go through the rest of this whole chapter very quickly. I'm just point out 5 sort of things that James touches on here in connection to what he's taught so far. We're not going to dig deep. It's going to be a one-day deal. Okay? And then what I want to do, come back to verse 2 when all that's said and done and ask the question, what exactly is a trial? Because a lot of stuff happens to me, but I need to figure out what the difference is between trials and something else, right? Something else. So that'll be the plan, Lord's will, and then we'll see what happens after that. But today, the goal is spiritual maturity. The only way you're going to achieve it is by the way you choose to respond to your difficulties. Let's have a word of prayer.